fact, part Chinese. Her great-great-grandfather actually immigrated to the United States and found work on the sort of construction of the transcontinental railroad. So I thought it was really interesting to see kind of her journey to this subject. So with this book, she goes a little bit outside of her comfort zone. Rather than China, she's focused on Korea, and her decision to do so was inspired by the Henya, who I mentioned briefly, are these female divers who are prominent in the island of Jeju. As you learn in the book, the Henya are sort of one of the kind of unique aspects of Jeju's culture. Their livelihoods depend on harvesting various sea life, and they've received widespread attention, both for their amazing diving abilities, as well as their unique matri-focused culture, right? So what's relatively unique in Henya culture within Korea, but also historically around East Asia, was the sort of economic role. In a lot of ways, the Henya were the primary breadwinners for their families. So sort of the unique organization of Henya communities, as well as the sort of amazing physical feats that they performed in their dives, really have led the Henya to become a point of interest, as well as more recently a point of pride for Jeju and Korea more broadly. She actually first learned about the Henya apparently while leafing through a magazine at the doctor's office. She saw a short article and really became fascinated, particularly by the Henya's sort of social organization, right? And it really fit with her previous interest in exploring the lives of strong women. And in a lot of ways, the Henya really fit that archetype quite well. She began researching the subject and ended up visiting Jeju and interviewing Henya personally. If you look at her excellent website on the book, she includes pictures from the trip and a range of resources for learning about Henya, which I found to be very helpful. So if this is something that you're interested in, I would highly recommend you check out her website. For me, for the historian in me, I think reading through that little sort of history of the book and the writing of the book itself was really heartening, because of all the research she did and how sort of the history that she infuses into her story really is grounded in historical research. And it really sort of gave me a little bit of sort of confidence coming into this talk, because I was concerned, not only because of my background not in literature, but also my lack of expertise in Henya. As Elena's introduction sort of indicated, my research is focused on a very different sort of perspective of South Korea. So my research specifically looks at sort of the economics of post-war South Korea. So looking at the rich culture of the Henya and Jeju itself was a little bit outside of my comfort zone. Luckily, I don't really think I have to do that, because Lisa C. does a great job in her book recreating what it might be, what it might have been like to be a Henya during the 20th century, and she provides those resources. So over the course of my talk, rather than focusing on the Henya specifically, I wanted to kind of zoom out and talk a little bit about the larger historical context, which I think, as much as Henya culture, plays a role in the sort of evolution of the friendship between the characters' two protagonists. So even though the book itself and much of the plot takes place in Jeju, for those of you who read the book, you can attest to the fact that developments outside of Jeju, whether they be in Korea or Asia or sort of global events, really influence what's going on. And I think historically that is very accurate, because Korea went through a very tumultuous 20th century. During that time, the country saw the end of a centuries-old dynasty, the colonization by a foreign country, went through 2 world wars, a division between North and South, a civil war, and then in South Korea, almost 30 years of military rule, right? So for Koreans, the 20th century was quite sort of a tumultuous time period. And it's something that I think Lisa C does a really good job of threading into her story. To give you a little bit of sense of the magnitude of the changes, I wanted to do in the next couple of slides, show how big a difference life might have been like in Korea between the year the book starts, 1938, and the year the book ends, 2008. Those are the 2 bookends. One thing I do want to note before proceeding is much of my discussion, particularly of the post-World War II period, is going to focus, like Lisa C's book does, on South Korea rather than North Korea. So a lot of this will be equally applicable to both Koreas, but there will be differences. One of the reasons for that is the way sort of C situates her book, but also South Korea is more where my expertise lies. Okay, so here is a very partial list of key events for understanding 20th century Korea. The events covered in the book roughly correspond to those listed in the purple box on this slide, but I included events that preceded the purple box, so came before, because I think they play an important role in understanding some of the sort of divisions depicted in the story itself. So going chronologically, I think one of the earliest sort of watersheds to be aware of and is present in the book is the shift in Korea between the Joseon dynasty to the sort of more modern nation state that we know today as Korea. So the Joseon dynasty was founded in 1392, and it really sort of was a continuous government administration through the 19th century. So what's really notable about Korea going into the 20th century is that it sort of was preceded by one of the longest continuous reigns by a single governmental organization. That major sort of longevity, I think, highlights the extreme rupture that occurs with the entry of the Japanese. So the Japanese colonial period officially began in 1910 when the Japanese Empire annexed Korea. However, Japan, as sort of this rising imperial power, played a role in South Korean politics dating back to 1876, which is when Japanese troops forcibly opened Korea to sort of foreign influence. We'll talk a little bit further about the Japanese colonial period in a little bit, but I just want to go through some of the events I see here. The next important event to understand is the 1919 March 1st protest movement. This really began the formal organizing among colonial era Koreans for the independence of Korea. And I think some of the kind of politics associated with this movement can be seen in Lisa C's story, specifically those who were sort of advocating and anti-Japanese on the island of Jeju, and those who sort of are most concerned with the sovereignty of Korea vis-a-vis the United States following the colonial period. And then this moves us into that purple box, which covers the sort of post-World War II period. And it was equally, I think, tumultuous. The country was divided shortly after Korea won its independence from Japan between two spheres, the northern controlled and then allied with the Soviet Union, and the south similarly initially governed by the United States and then closely allied with the United States. The sort of divisions that occurred within South Korean society due to the Cold War, I think, is something that isn't a major focus of the book, but something that I think is worth noting, and I think is still relevant for understanding modern Korea today. And then in South Korea, you see this 30-year period where anti-communism and sort of the military rule of the country really sort of was a polarizing influence. The main key takeaway for me from all of these events, rather than sort of the specifics of any single one, is one, the sheer magnitude of the changes, and second, how these ruptures, various social divisions, build upon each other. There's sort of the shift from the Joseon dynasty to the Japanese colonial period, and then the Japanese colonial period to the Cold War period, really kind of brought about new divisions, but they were intricately connected to divisions that existed in the previous era. And I think this is something that Lisa C. does a great job of teasing out when she writes about the evolution of the relationship between Yongsuk and Mija. That relationship undergoes changes as sort of these larger geopolitical events are unfolding, but sort of the kind of legacies of the previous period, past events, really build upon each other, and something that I'll talk about further in the second half of the talk. But I wanted to show you sort of the scope of the changes in 20th century Korea in a little bit different ways. I know that a list of events might not be the easiest way to comprehend sort of the magnitude of the changes. So the next two slides sort of give you the scope of the changes in sort of different formats. This one is in sort of a graphical format. If we look at sort of the demographics of the country itself, you can see how much has changed in Korea. So if you compare populations during the colonial period, the population of the entire peninsula was about 2.3 million, about 15.4 in what's now considered South Korea. By the 2010, the population of South Korea itself, you can see more than doubled that of colonial era Korea. In terms of government, you go from being a Japanese colony to an elected democracy. In terms of industry and economics, the primary sort of economic industry during the colonial period was agriculture. So Korea under Japanese rule was generally sort of tasked with providing rice and staples to the metropole, to Japan itself. That shifted over the course of the Cold War, and South Korea today is much more sort of driven by services. It's considered one of the more high-tech countries in the world. So if you think about the South Korean economy today, you usually think of Samsung, smartphones, television. So the economy of Korea has changed in a huge amount between the sort of period that characterized the start of the book and the period where the book ends. And finally, if you just want to see this change visually, I think these two pictures do a good job. It's on the sepia tone picture there is a picture of Myeongdong, which has sort of historically been one of the bigger sort of commercial areas in Seoul, which is the capital of South Korea. And the picture to the bottom, I don't know what left and right is for you, but the color picture is a picture of that same area today. So you can sort of see the dramatic changes. You could see the if you do know Korean, the text of the signs are in Japanese in the colonial era picture, and the ones in the modern one is more Korean and English, speaking to sort of the political changes that we talked about. You could see sort of banners being replaced by neon signs, right? So the scale of the change and how different everyday life is from the period at the start of the book and the end of the book is quite striking. This makes me, now that we've established just how sort of the much Korean society changed over the course of the book, I wanted to turn to sort of my first sort of set of themes. And the changes in Korean society is important for the book because much of the book is about sort of memory and how different people remember changes, right? So I think it's really interesting that much of the story is told through flashbacks rather than occurring or told contemporaneously. The book begins with the sort of flashback to the first meeting of our two protagonists, Young-suk and Mija. They meet and become friends during the latter phases of the Japanese colonial period. But sort of the divisions within Korean society that are evident from the Japanese colonial period really are evident from the start of their relationship. Mija is the daughter of a Japanese collaborator, and that fact really shapes her place in society and how she's viewed and treated by Young-suk. Like I said, what I think is most interesting about this book is how C uses memory and flashbacks and recollections to tell the history of their relationship. And I think it's really fitting and accords with what historians have written about Korea, because memory is a really sort of central feature in the way the scholarship of Korea has developed. Notably, for Americans, memory plays a role in Korea, but it's the lack of memory, right? One of the key events in modern Korean history, the Korean War, is popularly known in America as the Forgotten War, right? It doesn't have quite the same level of sort of attention focused on it that World War II or Vietnam does. And it's for this reason that many scholars and historians of Korea really have interrogated the concept of memory. So how things are remembered, by whom, to what end. As one of the foremost historians of modern Korea, Bruce Cummings writes, quote, "Knowledge is of course about memory, but memories also have histories." For me, I think this is really important for highlighting a universal, the subjectivity of history. How one remembers the past is related to our relationship to it. So how Young-suk remembers her past, her friendship with Mija is shaped by who she is, what her family, how her family views the world. And sort of, I think it's something that Lisa C. really sort of does a good job showing that her memories are not always sort of completely objective. And I think that's sort of one thing that I found to be quite compelling about this book. And in this next section, I really want to talk to you a little bit about how different Koreans might remember the 20th century differently, because our notions of sort of the past are really shaped by our notions of place and belonging. And Korea, given the sort of tumultuous history of the 20th century, really actually sort of provides sort of many different perspectives for remembering because of the many divisions and many sort of ruptures that you see occurring within Korean history. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the divisions, some of the ways in which memories might have diverged for different Koreans, and how they're sort of manifest themselves, how these divisions manifest themselves in the relationships that populate Lisa C's book. one quick thing to note, and something I'll return to, is that this isn't unique to Korea. I think memory and history is contested wherever you are. I do think it's particularly stark in Korea just because of how the scale of change that Korea underwent in the past century or so. All right, so the first kind of divide or sort of contested perspective to the past I want to discuss is that of Jeju itself. It's the main setting of the book. It's currently a province of South Korea. It's widely known as the Hawaii of South Korea. It's located off the southern coast of the mainland, and much of its economy today revolves around tourism. One thing to note about its history is that Jeju was not always part of the Korean dynasties or subsequently the Korean Empire and the Korean nation. It's known as Tamna, or island country, and it includes and sort of has an indigenous culture that is sort of built around sort of nature. So the sea, as the book shows, plays a large role in indigenous Jeju culture, as does the mountain the volcanic mountain at the center of the island itself, Mount Hala, which is mentioned but doesn't play quite as a central role as the sea does in Lisa C's book. But sort of the island itself, I think, shows the ways in which perspectives and views of the past can diverge. Divisions within Jeju itself, one major one that we see in Yeongseok and Mija is division between coastal communities and the interior, between Jeju City and the small village that Yeongseok is from, right? So, and I think sort of this reflects in many ways sort of the divisions that more broadly manifest themselves in the kind of divide between Jeju and the mainland of Korea itself. Like I said, Jeju was not always part of mainland Korea. It was officially annexed by the Goryeo dynasty, which preceded the Joseon dynasty. But the annexation took place in about 1105. So, you know, it's not sort of ancient history, but in the relatively recent past, Jeju was an independent entity. And I think that division that you see manifests itself throughout the book between sort of the indigenous island culture of Jeju-do and the more mainland sort of centralized, unified Korean culture, right? And I think this point of divergence manifests itself in various ways. One really interesting one is views and roles of women. One of the things that's very sort of strikingly different and unique about Jeju is the role of Henya within sort of the political economy of Jeju-do. But what you see that being contrasted to is in mainland Korea, which is much more Confucian in its organization, and Confucianism being very strict about the role of men and women within society is much more patriarchal vis-a-vis the sort of more matrifocal society that you find in Jeju, right? So that's one ironic division that you sort of see given sort of the modern views on gender relations, but sort of during the sort of initial early part until very recently, the kind of role and prominence of women in decision-making in Jeju-do was sort of seen as sort of one of the ways in which it was backwards vis-a-vis sort of mainland Korea, right? And you see throughout the book the way that this clash and sort of this division between islanders and mainlanders plays out. Particularly, you see that once Mija gets married to her husband who has stronger ties to mainland Korea. So these are some of the internal divisions within Korea itself that precede sort of the major kind of first watershed that occurs during the 20th century, which is the beginning of the Japanese colonial period. You can see from this map just how much Korea changes just geographically following its incorporation into the Japanese Empire. It goes from being a sovereign entity on the Korean peninsula to part of sort of this regional empire, which at its height, which is pictured on this slide today, comes to encompass large swaths of the Pacific. The impact of Japanese colonialism on Korean society really can't be overstated. Everyone sort of experienced vast changes to their lives. Although as the book shows, the exact nature and sort of scale of the changes that people experienced depended on who you were and in some cases where you were. Right? I think one thing I want to note about the Japanese colonial period is that it wasn't black and white. People were not just collaborators with the Japanese and sort of anti-Japanese resistors. Most people existed somewhere in the middle where they sort of went back and forth depending on their sort of individual circumstances. And I think this is one of the things that the story of Mija really highlights in particular, how the ways that sort of matters about sort of practical life and death matters really superseded the more kind of ideological ones that have to do with sort of collaboration versus resistance, right? So I think one thing to sort of think about as you read the book is how complicated it was to live under sort of colonial rule and how that contrasts with sort of more kind of surface level understandings of colonialism as being a black and white, good versus evil, sort of collaborator versus resistor division that I think a lot of sort of discussions and sort of even histories, I think, depict the society as, and sort of what that means when sort of thinking about how the past is remembered. So those are just a few, I think, really important sort of different vantage points that different characters in the book, but more broadly Koreans, looking back on the 20th century, could draw upon when sort of forming memories and opinions and worldviews. And I think in this last section, I want to wrap this talk up by talking about how these different perspectives and memories led to sort of really tragic consequences, particularly during the Korean War period. The sort of divisions within society weren't just sort of in the realm of ideas and values, but actually sort of equated into life and death during times of war. The divisions that I talked about really emerging during the colonial period were actually intensified rather than alleviated following Korea's independence. So following the end of World War II, Korea was liberated, although it didn't become a sovereign entity, in large part due to increasing Cold War tensions. The peninsula was divided into two regions, the North and South. As I mentioned, the North was allied and actually initially controlled by the Soviet Union, and the South by the United States. Interesting to note sort of the artificiality of this division. This is a map from the National Geographic, and the 38th parallel where the North and South Korea was actually divided was made and decided using a map very similar to this one, two US Army colonels at the time, Charles Bonesteel and Dean Rusk, who would go on to have a storied career as a US diplomat. They were tasked with finding a suitable dividing line for the communist and non-communist Koreas, and they used this map and almost sort of no prior knowledge to what was going on in Korea or Korean culture to divide up the country. And I think I wanted to highlight this point just because the understanding of South Korea and North Korea as closely affiliated with the communist and non-communist causes is sort of a very overly simplified view, because on the ground, things were much more complicated. And this is something that I think Lisa C does a really good job of highlighting in the chapters that cover the Korean War period. Koreans really understood the division and sort of the post-war reconstruction of the country through a local lens, not through this idea of a global struggle between communism and anti-communism. Primarily, there was sort of this divide over the redistribution of resources, right? There was this impulse among many Koreans that the inequalities that built up during the Japanese colonial period, and even further back to the period of the Joseon dynasty, needed to be resolved. And there needed to be sort of an equitable distribution of resources and political power. So these are people like Young-suk's husband, right, that really believed that a sovereign Korea would be sort of more equal and more egalitarian. Ironically, this actually contrasted with the goals of the US military, which first and foremost sought to impose order on this sort of decolonizing nation. And it became to view many of these individuals who wanted sort of equality and wanted sort of justice for the ills of the colonial period, rather than sort of to bring a communist government into power. They were seen as the enemies in a lot of ways for practical reasons. Sort of the demands that they were making were ones that so the US military and government that was established really didn't have the wherewithal or the interest in addressing. So what you see occurring in sort of South Korea following World War II is empowerment of those with ties to the Japanese government. So people like Mija's husband, rather than Chunbu, actually are seen as loyal Koreans. And it really leads to sort of devastating consequences. And you can see, while the US didn't play a direct role in creating a lot of these divisions, by the organization and the decisions that they make while they were sort of in charge of Southern Korea, really contributed to their sort of exacerbation. And one of the major kind of flashpoints of this was the Jeju Uprising, which occurred between the spring of 1948 to May 1949. And sort of the book does a great job highlighting the fact that this was a conflict not so much between communists and anti-communists, but sort of conflicting ideas about how to recreate South Korea, right? So much more prominent was this division between collaborator versus resistor, right? So people like Young-suk's husband really believed that sort of the colonial period brought about injustices that needed to be rectified. And even though he wasn't a radical, people like him really sort of became stamped with sort of became stamped as communist, and really it led to these sort of horrific stories over the course of the Jeju Uprising, anti-communist forces of the South Korean government. And with the support of the US military, really cracked down heavily on people demanding reform in Jeju and in other parts of South Korea. Over the course of the Jeju Uprising, it's estimated that up to 30,000 were killed, about 10% of the island's population. One of the events, the Pukchon massacre, occurred in January 17th, and it's sort of roughly what is the inspiration for the climactic scene of the book itself. I won't go into the details of the scene, but I think I wanted to highlight just how these differing worldviews and differing memories of what happened in the past and what sort of needed to happen in the future really led to these dramatic consequences in the context of the Cold War and then the Korean War that would begin in 1950. One quick note that I want to make about the Jeju Uprising. It's a very contested event until today. Even today, in 2000, the South Korean government established a truth commission for investigating sort of the human rights abuses that were alleged over the previous decades. The commission's report, which was published in 2003, reported that at least 15,000 victims were identified, and really sort of confirmed the idea that sort of the anti-communist forces sort of committed widespread atrocities during the event. Well, running a little short on time, so I'll wrap this up quickly. What happened on Jeju before the Korean War really sort of is a microcosm of what happened in Korea itself. The war really solidified much of the divisions formally along the 38th parallel. So you see North Korea and South Korea becoming independent nations. One thing to note is the war itself continued literally while combat was ended by the armistice that was signed in 1953. The war is officially still going on. And that's an important fact for understanding post-war South and North Korea. Both nations remained heavily militarized, particularly during the Cold War period. So many of those sort of divisions, the accusations of being a communist, sort of ties to Japan, these questions that sort of sparked the widespread violence on Jeju continued in both South and North Korea over the subsequent decades. And as many of you know, sort of the larger division of the peninsula itself persists to this day. And I think this is something that I can talk a little bit further about in Q&A, but I wanted to just show you, I think, one of the most striking visual representations of this continued division. This is a picture taken by NASA of the Korean Peninsula at night, and it really shows you how different the two societies are. South Korea really underwent a rapid economic period of rapid economic growth, in large part due to its relationship with the United States and specifically the US military, while North Korea since the 1980s at least has really seen a precipitous decline. I think one of the sort of nice things about, not nice, but appropriate aspects of the book is it sort of ends with an unresolved, without firm resolution in the friendship between Young-suk and Mija, and I think it reflects sort of the unresolved nature of the tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Okay, so to briefly wrap up, and then as a way of conclusion, I wanted to return to this idea of memory and history. I think one of the things that I try and stress in all of my classes is the way that history is not objective. I think often we think about history as sort of a laundry list of indisputable facts, who did what, when, and where. However, I think good history, and in many ways this book, one of the reasons why I like this book is it highlights sort of the malleability of history, how memories have histories. And if we zoom out, I think it's interesting to think about the ways that Lisa C's book's discussion of Korea is unique in its specifics to Korean history, but many of the stories and tensions that you see being sort of portrayed in the book itself could be set in much of the world. This is a map of sort of the decolonization that occurred following World War II. And a lot of the questions about collaboration versus resistance, communist versus anti-communist, influence sort of the relationships in the book, reflect realities on the ground in many places around the world today. And as citizens, residents of the United States, I think it's worth thinking a little bit about the role of the United States. Like in the book, the US isn't sort of directly culpable for many of the divisions and atrocities, but is omnipresent. This is a map of all the US military installations that were around the world in 2014. I think one indisputable reality of the post-World War II period is the central role that the US and the US military played in sort of the resolution of many of these divisions and controversies that emerge following World War II and the end of empire and imperialism. So I went a little bit over, so I'll end there. I'm looking forward to any and all questions. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Chung. If anybody has any, oh wait, we have a question. That was a fascinating, before I go to the question, I just want to say that was an absolutely fascinating lecture. And I will fully admit that I do not know enough about Korea and the Korean War as I should, and do not feel that I was educated on it in high school or even college for that matter. So this has been very informative. But we do have a question from Laura. Were there any details or specifics in the book that you think we need to read with a grain of salt?
I think one thing that stuck in my head a little bit is maybe the kind of prominence of women even on Jeju. I think one thing that shouldn't be overstated is the power that Henya have in larger sort of Korean society. I think there's an impression from the book that that's like all of Jeju, but one thing to remember is there's sort of differences in culture even within Jeju itself. So I think within some of these coastal communities where the Henya live, the sort of matrilineal focus of or matrilineal organization might be applicable, but even within the inland areas of Jeju itself, the sort of role of men in patriarchy and traditional gender roles was pretty strong. And I think that's one thing I think is worth keeping in mind at reading this book specifically, right? In some ways, these Henya communities were the exception that proved the rule more so than vice versa.
Thank you. Next question. How are the offspring of the Japanese collaborators viewed in Korea today?
Yeah, I think what's really fascinating about that question is it depends where you are, who you are. I think it is a very important issue. You see periodically among Korean celebrities and sort of public figures who it comes out had ties or their family had ties to the Japanese government, colonial government, really sort of having to apologize, right? So in the sort of realm of public opinion, I do think that is very important. But I think one of the challenges with that is sort of this post-war history of South Korea makes it so there isn't sort of a universal condemnation of families with ties to the Japanese colonial government, just because a lot of the people who ran the country for so long and much of the economic elites, by virtue partially due to the decisions made by the United States, had ties to the Japanese colonial government. And one sort of prominent example of it is the family that is sort of associated with the Samsung Corporation. They had historically had ties with the Japanese government, however, still sort of were able to prosper in many ways during the post-war period. So I think this is sort of not a black and maybe not a clear answer that you might want, but I think it's complicated. It's like a very important issue, and generally there is an opinion that collaborators are viewed negatively, but depending on who you are, that might or might not really have consequences for your everyday life.
I have a comment from Dorothy. Thank you for this comprehensive presentation. I've already read the book, but now I plan to read it again with your presentation in mind.
Oh, thank you so much.
That's really nice. And yeah, I feel the same way. And Anne also, excellent presentation. So she wanted to let you know how much she enjoyed it. Does anybody else have any questions? Oh, now that's going to be recorded. Good. Superb. Thank you. Thanks. So there's another comment. Well worth my time. You gotta love to hear that. Okay, well, I think, oh, here's one asking about the, try to get this right. Henya today.
Oh, yeah, I would first say recommend going to Lisa C's website because I think she has a lot of worthwhile resources. The Henya were something that I didn't know much about coming into reading the book and the presentation. But just roughly speaking, I think one of the things about the Henya is that they're sort of increasingly dying out, in the sense that in the previous few decades, there are less and less sort of young women sort of willing to kind of undertake sort of the physical rigors associated with becoming a diver. So in a lot of ways, they're sort of becoming a sort of a increasingly sort of historical relic rather than sort of a continuing sort of social reality. Yeah, and I think one thing that is notable is that since the 70s and 80s, there's been an effort in South Korea, some by the South Korean government, to sort of celebrate the heritage of the Henya. So one of the things that is sort of associated with them is they have been given the designation of a UNESCO intangible cultural heritage of South Korea. So that is one thing. They're sort of prominent in the culture, but sort of actual Henya are becoming fewer and fewer today.
Susan cannot wait to add this to their booked up club discussion. That's wonderful. There actually is a discussion of the book next Friday. Sorry, no. Yes, next Friday on the 9th. So if anybody wants to join, they're more than welcome. This is actually a question for me. When will the presentation be available on YouTube? Tomorrow or Wednesday is what I'm thinking. This will be my first time posting. Well, I'm not the one posting, but this is my first time recording. So you can always email me. My email is on the LibCal emails that you got with the reminders and the Zoom links and all that other stuff. You can sign up for the Friday discussion through worcesterlibrary.org and then just go into events. Michelle says thank you. Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah.
All right, we got 2 minutes. If anybody else has anything to ask, add. I think we're good. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. The libraries miss you. I know some of you probably aren't in Worcester County, and we really miss you all. Oh, is Patrick able to travel often to Korea?
It's been a while since I've been to Korea, actually. I did go back and forth a lot more while I was doing research for my thesis, but since I've gotten a job, it's gotten harder and harder. I was actually supposed to go this summer, but COVID happened, so I haven't been able to go. So hopefully I'll be able to return, but I think it's been 4 years since I've been to Korea, actually.
Probably a lot of changes since then, too. Everywhere, right? Good question. Wait. We are all waiting to travel. That was a response from the person who asked the question. Absolutely, we are. Yeah, totally. I'd be happy to leave the state. All right, well, I think I'm going to end it there because it is just about 3 o'clock. Thank you again, everyone, for being here. And thank you so much, Dr. Chung. Really appreciate it.